All right, so just like Windows, iOS, macOS, Linux is an operating system. In fact, it just so happens to work out that it's one of the most popular platforms on the planet. Even Android is powered by the Linux operating system. So an operating system is software that manages all of the hardware resources associated with your desktop or laptop. So to put that simply, the operating system manages the communication between your software and your hardware. So without the operating system, the OS, the software that you have wouldn't function. So Linux has zero cost of entry. Yeah, you heard that right. It's free. So that means you can install Linux on as many computers as you like without having to pay a cent for software or server licensing. Linux is also distributed under an open source license. So an open source will follow these key tenets: the freedom to run the program for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and change it to make it do what you wish, the freedom to redistribute copies so that you can help your neighbor, the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others. So Linux has a number of different versions to suit any type of user. From new users to hardcore users, you'll find a flavor of Linux to match your needs. So these versions are called distributions, or in short, distros. In fact, nearly every distro of Linux can be downloaded for free, burned onto a disk or USB thumb drive, and installed on as many machines as you like. Some of the popular Linux distributions include Debian, Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Solus, Fedora, Elementary OS, OpenSUSE, Manjaro, and of course, Kali Linux. Now, don't think that the server has been left behind. For this arena, you can always turn to Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Ubuntu Server, CentOS, SUSE Enterprise Linux. Now, some of the above server distributions are free, such as Ubuntu Server and CentOS, and some have an associated price, such as Red Hat Enterprise Linux and SUSE Enterprise Linux. Those with an associated price, of course, will also include support. So the Linux operating system comprises several different pieces. Bootloader, the software that manages the boot process of your computer. For most users, it will simply be a splash screen that pops up and eventually goes away to boot into the operating system. Kernel, this is the one piece of the whole that is actually called Linux. The kernel is the core of the system, and it manages the CPU, memory, and peripheral devices. The kernel is the lowest level of the OS. Init system. So this is a subsystem that bootstraps the user space and is charged with controlling daemons. One of the most widely used init systems is systemd, which also happens to be one of the most controversial. It is the init system that manages the boot process once the initial booting is handed over from the bootloader. That is Grub or Grand or Unified Bootloader. Daemons. So these are background services, printing, sound, scheduling, etc., that either start up during boot or after you log into your desktop. Graphical server. So this is a subsystem that displays the graphics on your monitor. It's commonly referred to as the X server or just X. Desk environment. This is the piece that the users actually interact with. There are many desktop environments to choose from: GNOME, Cinnamon, Mate, Pantheon, Enlightenment, KDE, XFace, etc. Each desktop environment includes built-in applications, such as file managers, configuration tools, web browsers, and games. Applications. So desktop environments do not offer the full array of apps, right? Just like Windows, macOS, Linux offers thousands upon thousands of high-quality software titles that can easily be found and installed. Most modern Linux distributions, we'll talk about this more below, will include an App Store-like tool that will centralize and, simplify application installation. For example, Ubuntu Linux has the Ubuntu Software Center, which is a rebrand of GNOME software. But anyway, it'll allow you to quickly search among the thousands of apps and install them from one centralized location. Who doesn't like that? Now, a shell is a user interface for access to an operating system's services. So in other words, if the user wants the operating system to do something, they will then use a shell for this purpose. It's a command language interpreter that executes commands read from input devices such as keyboards or even from files. So in general, operating system shells use either a command line interface, CLI, or graphical user interface, GUI. Command line shells called terminal in Linux and macOS, or command prompt in Windows. Graphical shells provide means for manipulating programs based on graphical user interface, or GUI, by allowing for operations such as opening and closing, moving, resizing windows, as well as switching focus between windows. Now, it's named a shell because it's the outermost layer around the operating system kernel. The kernel is a computer program that is the core of a computer's operating system, with complete control over everything in the system. So it'll manage the following resources of the Linux system: file management, process management, input-output management, memory management, device management, etc., etc. Now, there are several shells for Linux, such as TCSH, KSH, and ZSH. But one of the more common ones is Bash, where the name is an actual acronym for Born Again Shell. So each shell does the same job, but it understands different commands and provides different built-in functions. So if the screen shows a $sign or hash on the left of a blinking cursor, well, you're in a command line environment. The $sign and hash symbols indicate the user account type that you're logged into. The $sign means you are a normal user. Hash means that you are the system administrator, or root. Now, in the C shell, the prompt ends with a percentage sign. The tilde means home directory. That is the default directory when first logging in. Now, there are differences on prompts in different Unix or GNU Linux distributions because of their default settings. But in general, the prompt usually shows the login username, machine host name, and current working directory, and ending with a $sign, percentage, or hash sign. So a desktop environment is the first thing you're going to see when your computer is ready for you to use. Windows and Mac users will usually find the concept confusing because both of these operating systems come pre-installed with their desktop environments, right? But with Linux, you can actually select and install any desktop environment that you want to place on your system. I'll show you some of the best desktop environments. GNOME. GNOME is easy to use. A clean and modern desktop environment that's a bit minimalistic, I would say, compared to other available Linux desktop environments. GNOME is well known, and it's one of the most useful and best Linux desktop environments for Linux users. XFace, or XFCE, is one of the most lightweight desktop environments out there. So if you have an old computer and you need to have more free memory for other applications, XFace is very suitable for this. KDE is one of the most popular desktop environments. Now, you may also refer to it as the Plasma desktop. Plasma offers all the tools required for modern desktop computing experience, so you can be productive right from the start. Now, Unity, I would say, is probably one of the best-known versions of the Linux desktop. It was a former default interface for Ubuntu. From Ubuntu 17.10 to the GNOME desktop environment has become the default interface instead of Unity. So it looks modern and offers good filtering features. All right, so the Linux file hierarchy structure defines the directory structure and directory contents in Unix-like operating systems. It is maintained by the Linux Foundation. / represents a root folder. All files and directories appear under the root directory, even if they are stored on different physical or even virtual devices. Only the root user has the right to write under this directory. So /bin, essential command binaries that need to be available in user mode. For example, cat, ls, cp, etc. /home, the user's home directories containing saved files, personal settings, and all that kind of stuff. /sbin, Linux commands located under this directory are used typically by system administrators for system maintenance purposes like rebooting, ifconfig, that kind of thing. /boot contains bootloader files. For example, grub files are located under /boot. /etc, and you may have heard /etc. This will contain configuration files required by all programs. For example, resolve.config. /lib. These are libraries essential for the binaries in /bin and /sbin. /dev. Essential device files, including terminal devices, USBs, or any device attached to the system. For example, /dev/null. /opt. This will contain optional application software packages. /proc contains information about system process and kernel. /mnt, temporary mount directory, where sysadmins can mount file systems. /var. It contains variable data like system logging files and temporary files. /media mounts points for removable media such as CD-ROMs and the like. /tmp contains temporary files created by system as well as users. /srv contains site-specific data served by this particular system, such as data and scripts for web servers. /user contains binaries, libraries, documentation, and source code for second-level programs.